Today, the nation with the largest global merchant fleet in the world is not Realmion or Arcadia, but the Vinnick merchant republics. The merchant states, hailing from the lands of old Euromia, hold a monopoly over the transportation and trade between the New World and the Old World, enriching the trade guilds, merchant families that dominate the Old World markets with New World resources. Their fleets, despite being not as powerful as the likes of Westfer or Realmion, hold the second largest fleets, second only to Realmion, owned largely by the most profitable and largest trading company in Albion, the CCC, the Canoparian Trade Company. With their wealth and power, they conquered the Canoparian Sea and the coastal cities around it, holding naval dominance in the region and a stranglehold over the economies of the region. But how did a power from these squabbling states in the Old World come to dominate global trade? Hi, I'm Anmo, and this is episode 2 of Worldbuilding Empires in the Firedust of Albion universe. You can watch other videos on said universe in the playlist below after this one. Hope you enjoy. Our story begins thousands of years ago. In the land known today as Vinia, the region was a patchwork of clans, tribes, city-states, and alliances. Not much is actually known about this period besides what later scholars tell us about, and even then, it's unreliable due to later historical purges. But what we do know is how the period ended. Around 600 BBA, an alliance of cities and clans from the region of West Euromia unified and conquered the rest of Vinia. Centering around the city of Zaril, the first dynasty rose up as the rulers of Vinia. Previously, it was believed that many different gods and deities were worshipped throughout the land. But with the conquests of Zaril, all the other gods and pantheons were purged, and only the city's gods were allowed to be worshipped, the Zorosari pantheon. According to legends, the first ruler of this kingdom was Euromia, a ruler ordained by the ruler of the gods, Hular, to be the ruler of all mankind upon Ea and his descendants after him, and so the kingdom of Vinia renamed to Euromia after their first ruler, creating the royal cult around the king, and it is believed that those who were favored by him are favored by the gods. The kingdom, through the centuries, expanded, and soon half of Anvalon was under their control. But that is when a civil war between two sides of the royal family broke out. Not much record survived from that period, but what came as a result was the burning of Zaril and many other cities, and soon the crowning of the first emperor, Lizai Menekart, creating the Menekartian dynasty. By 312 BBA, Emperor Lizai had reworked imperial authority and rewrote the Zorosari pantheon, making himself the manifestation of the god of life, Maral, making himself and his descendants as vessels of the divine, replacing Hular. The primary consequence of his rule was actually his historical revisionism. Many historical documents from period long past, including their copies, were destroyed. A narrative was remade to refit imperial propaganda and justify the Menekartian mission to conquer the world step by step. By the end of his rule, all of Anvalon was under imperial control. Slowly but surely, the empire grew with successive emperors, who kept the imperial cult and the Zorosari pantheon. And by 1503 BBA, half of the Meditar seas were conquered by them, from Kenem to Euromia. The nation of divine emperors was about to face a foe unlike what it had previously known, however. Rumors and harrowing tales of demonic and undead scourges spread throughout the empire from the lands of Realmion. The emperors previously avoided the land because of its plagues and monsters that roamed through it. But an unexpected miracle happened. The scourge was defeated at the hands of an angel who liberated Realmion from its demonic control. These tales spread throughout the empire, leading Emperor Malaise Menekart to have a keen interest in Realmion. Soon after, in 32 ABA, he sent an army of 100,000 to Realmion through the north and managed to conquer the northern half of the peninsula. He then struck a deal with the Kingdom of Pendor in the south, allowing their religion and their Eternian church to remain in exchange for them to surrender. From then on, imperial banners of Eurom flew over Pendor and Realmion as a whole for centuries. From that point on, Eurom, under the next few successive emperors, successfully grew in power to rule over most of the western half of the Old World. By 300 ABA, the empire became the most powerful it had ever been, but that's when it started to go wrong. The divine throne has always been tied to the Zorosari pantheon, but at that point, Eurom had absorbed so many groups and cultures, it had become impossible for the pantheon to be enforced. The primary method of control was allowing these cultures to remain so long as they worshipped the emperor, and for a while this worked. However, things deteriorated as cultures and nations put less emphasis on the emperor, or rejecting it outright, like the Eternian Church and the FoA, and more specifically with Eternity. The absorption of Realmion only allowed the church to grow throughout the empire in pockets and communities, replacing local deities and gods with a monotheistic religion. This terrified the Euramian and Menekartian nobles who sought to maintain imperial worship. But in 325 ABA, Emperor Marius III was crowned, and he did something unprecedented. He refused to bow to the statues of the Zorosari god and proclaimed his faith in Eternity. This had shocked the imperial nobility, who immediately sought to denounce him, but with the support of his imperial legions and the sheer popularity amongst the commoners, who by that point worshipped Eternity, publicly or secretly, they were unable to. So Marius began tearing down the old imperial priesthood and Zorosari cults within Zorel, planned and funded the construction of the Zorel Grand Cathedral, and sought to convert as much of the nobility as possible. But his efforts did not bear fruit, as more imperial nobles spoke out against him, leading him to do a drastic decision. In 347 ABA, he moved the imperial capital from Zorel to Pendor, upending centuries of imperial rule from the lands of Euromia itself. The fallout from this was swift. By the time the announcement was public, Marius had already left, anticipating it, leading to the pagan nobles of Anvalon to crown one of their own as emperor, Molokai II, and his first decree was to denounce Marius and ban any other religion but the Zorosari pantheon and the imperial cult. The ruling became deeply unpopular in Anvalon and most of the empire outside of Euromia itself. General Eliathiromari conquered and proclaimed his control over Northardia and Canem, leading to the period of the three dominions: the dominion of Marius, the dominion of Molokai, and the dominion of Eliathar. But this period did not last long, as by 378 ABA, Molokai was killed and all hell broke loose as generals rose up in rebellion against the pagan nobles, while the peasants and commoners rioted as a result of the martyrdom of Saint Iliasos of Haldarin. By 402 ABA, the dominion of Anvalon collapsed. The 30-year-long chaos that came after destroyed most of what was previously thriving cities of Euromia. By the end, none of the nobility survived, and the generals and warlords that rose out of it saw no interest in the now destroyed heartlands, allowing the commoners and locals to rule for themselves without nobility. For hundreds of years, the region rebuilt without a king or prince, primarily due to the distraction of the newly founded kingdoms that ignored them and the beginning of the four great migrations that entered into West Merida and Northardia, bringing with them Abbassians, Kavars, Slovakans, and the Oholak hordes. This allowed the region to develop its own cultures and ways of life, separate from the rest of feudal Anvalon and Realmion. In the beginning, peasant republics formed between villages and towns. Soon these republics consolidated into alliances and confederations, until they unified into proper nations ruled by powerful landowners, merchants, businessmen, without royal titles. However, this became a problem for these republics. The monarchies of the rest of Anvalon sought to influence and eventually conquer these republics. The kingdom of Haldarin sought to conquer Andeltros and the Velartes to gain a coastline, while the Duchy of Almerny wished to subdue Zoros into its dominion. And with the backing of powerful kingdoms like Solvans, they were able to threaten these republics easily. Not to mention the constant infighting between these republics and cities and territories constantly switching hands between them. But for no matter what reason they wanted to conquer Vinia, there was always one primary constant: the strategic advantage the region held. You see, Vinia was situated at the center of the southern Meditar, right next to the Strait of Hayrali, meaning merchant vessels from the far east and the south that travel through the strait first arrive at these cities and republics. That's part of the reason why these states became so wealthy in the first place. And so the kingdoms of the region sought to control the flow of trade, thus the flow of wealth into Anvalon, and the states knew that. In 816 ABA, Almerny hired a mercenary company to attack and take control of Zarel and the Zoros Confederacy as a whole. Instead of being neutral, Antimon and the Velartes and Andeltros sent a relief force towards Zoros to defeat the invading mercenaries under Duke Duvali. The coalition won, and the Almernish armies withdrew, and the mercenary captain, Budgen, was killed in the Battle of Rokail. The reason why these states intervened was because it was obvious that if one of their states fell, more would eventually fall, and thus, if they all stood together, they would all survive and continue their trade monopoly. In 843 ABA, Zoros, the Velartes, and Kilos signed l'Accordo Commune, or the Common Agreement, often cited as the founding document of the Vinnick merchant republics. Initially created as an alliance to ensure the continued trade of spices, textiles, and other commodities from the south and the east into western Merida, soon, however, as more states joined, disagreements within the union began to form, and so the Republic of Andeltros called for an assembly in Vinnick itself. There, guilds, businessmen, merchant families, landowners, mercenaries, mayors, governors, and elected leaders gathered to discuss the next step for the Common Agreement, before finally signing the Treaty of Vinales, normalizing a full integrated confederation of states represented through elected bodies within the system. The Common Assembly was to represent the interests of the most powerful merchants, companies, lords, and landowners, as well as influential figures in guilds and orders. The High Council is made up of the member states' governors, with a premier acting as the first amongst equals. Then the lower assemblies acting as governing bodies for local affairs of each member state. This was the official founding of the Vinnick merchant republics as a legally unified entity, powerful enough to challenge the powers of Anvalon and beyond. Soon, the Union incorporated other states outside of Vinia, such as Omonra, the Canteles, and Kazash. But it wasn't without conflict. When the island of Cyrenil broke off from Acladia and sought to join the VMR in 955 ABA, a coalition of monarchies from Hyverium, Acladia, Solvans, and Realmion sought to curb the power of the VMR, beginning the Meditar Wars. This led to a stalemate, and Cyrenil was absorbed into Hyverium, much to the dismay of Acladia. In another incident, in 1103 ABA, the VMR attempted to attack and take control of the city of Hayrali from the Ashkavarik or Koryat after threatening to close the strait due to certain trade disagreements, but failed due to local resistance as well as Kavari and Abbasian reinforcements. By that point, the VMR reached its territorial height in Merida, as it was unable to expand any further due to local powers and its own limitations within its political system. But in 1219 ABA, a second war broke out between the VMR, Hyverium, and Ashkavar that ended up closing the Strait of Hayrali, and this time, something interesting happened. Due to the troubles in the conflict of the Second Meditar War, Realmion, under King Aerys I, sought to maintain trade with the East, and so launched an expedition around Ardea into the East. But something interesting was discovered: the Isle of Runes in the far west. Prior to this, it was believed by most of the world that Ruane was the only major landmass in Ea, believing that the entire world was already discovered. But the discovery of the island changed things, and Relmion continued, later discovering Quintera and finally Albion. News of this discovery came slow though, and initially the VMR had no interest in this discovery, believing it only to be a couple of islands out in the mighty ocean. But as news spread of a whole other world and continent outside in the far west, things changed. After the war subsided and the strait reopened, the VMR sought to maintain its position as the masters of commerce in their region, and saw the New World as an opportunity. In 1255 ABA, a fleet of merchant vessels under Captain Lerianus de Leo was sent to the New World. When he arrived there, he founded the first major trade port, Port Marialos, on the island of Kotaile, and made contact with locals. And what the Vinians found was unexpected. The locals were not human, well, not fully. They had animal features, mostly feline, and had distinct and unique cultures different to anything Vinia has come across at this point, and most importantly, an abundance of resources. When news arrived of exotic materials and trade potential, the VMR and its powerful companies began investing in trade outposts and buying of local sire goods. De Leo, however, found a special opportunity. The companies of the Old World relied on his vessels to transport goods and wished to expand their operations in the Canoparian, so he decided to monetize trade into the lands, charging ships of different companies to pay tolls and taxes on Marialos and other ports under his control. He then, using the funds, founded the CCC, Compagnia Commerciale Canopariana, or the Canoparian Trade Company, and founded the city of New Danas as its primary headquarters. However, as 1278 ABA rolled around, more trade outposts were established, and merchant vessels came and went. The Old World corporations began to get irritated by the monopoly posed by the CCC. They lobbied hard in the Common Assembly against De Leo's control of the trade between the New World and Vinia, so the Council and Premier issued an order of disownership, stripping De Leo of the CCC and transferring it to the VMR itself, withdrawing the ridiculously high taxes and tolls from the VMR vessels or any other company. After this, VMR presence in the Canoparian surged and expanded greatly and rapidly through the 14th century. The CCC, under the command of the VMR's Anayamani, launched a number of attacks against Sayer tribes and clans on the islands around the Canoparian. The powerful kingdom of Monairial fell after refusing to allow VMR trade vessels in, turning it into a Sayer penal colony. An alliance of Sayer clans in Maona was defeated by CCC forces and mercenaries, and a popular Sayer revolt was put down in the Nuaroka Islands. However, the colonial efforts of the VMR hit a major roadblock in Middle Albion. The VMR-controlled settlements and Sayer towns overlapped claims by the Empire of Westford. The situation got so messy, many settlements raised Westfarish and Vinnick flags at the same time, while others did not even raise a flag at all and were considered forgotten. In the north, the pioneer settlers came and blocked meaningful expansion into Haranon, while in the west, Mayera formed a powerful slave state that made a lot of lucrative deals with Vinnick companies and directly bought slaves in exchange for weapons and mercenaries and other necessities. By 1399 ABA, the wealth that came to Vinia proper as a result was enormous. New World merchants who came to Vinia charged massive markups for their imports, which spread throughout Western Merida as commodities, allowing the VMR to maintain the largest fleet of merchant vessels in Albion for a very long time. This changed, however, with the beginning of the Second Continental War. The threat posed by Arcadia and her allies against the Eastern colonial forces posed a major threat to the VMR's trade interests. Declarations caused a massive number of Sayers to openly revolt against the VMR control, and led many to enter piracy. Although the VMR hasn't directly been involved in the war, they largely financed the war against Arcadia while holding off pirates and rebels, as well as destroying Litharia's fleet in the Canoparian. After the war, many saw the massive expansion of Realmion's influence in North Albion as a threat. They were the primary fighters of the conflict and gained the most out of anyone, and their fleets almost doubled in size, now becoming equal to the VMR's fleets. This led to a quiet coalition forming between the VMR, Westfur, and Yuktavania to curb the power of Realmion. In 1418, the VMR backed the Old Banners Rebellion in Realmion, attempting to overthrow House Castrian to replace them with a puppet, but this failed, leading to the Greater Oceanic War, where the VMR, Westfur, and Yuktavania launched attacks against Realmion and Solvans, both in the Old World and the New World. Realmion, however, ended up winning the war for the most part. VMR mercenaries failed to capture the crown colonies of East Haranon, and a lot of their vessels were destroyed, leaving Realmion as the largest naval power in Albion. Realmion also began financing privateers against Vinian merchant vessels in the Canoparian to disrupt CCC trade between Vinia and Canoparia. In turn, the VMR blocked Realmian vessels from entering the Canoparian, as well as the southern Metatar in the Old World. As all these indirect attacks played out, as a result of the Sayer rebellions against the VMR, a separation system was introduced to separate the Vinian merchants and elite class from the Sayer peasants and locals, keeping most of them impoverished and vulnerable. The wealth disparity between them became high as jobs outside colonial authorities became less and less viable. Many were forced to become indentured servants and menial labor workers in plantations, farms, and mines on Canoparia's islands and coasts. Many, however, did not accept this life. Many Sayers left their lives on the islands and coasts to the seas and became pirates, raiders, and bandits, hitting CCC vessels and other merchant vessels. Though many did it for the sake of greed and money, most did it to fund their families and livelihoods, forced to risk their lives for plunder to feed their loved ones. Piracy issues became so rampant, the VMR issued an order to build up even more warships to control and patrol the Canoparian, and the locals are no help, as the vast majority saw the pirates not as a band of raiding marauders, but as freedom-fighting Robin Hood-type thieves, stealing from the rich and giving to the poor. Not to mention, at least 1 in 5 families had one of their members become a pirate, so most families had incentive to keep their secrets. This only made life under the VMR even more strained, as collective punishment was used as a deterrent for future piracy. This did not work. The position of the VMR in Albion and the Old World has never been more precarious in the present day. Foreign powers seek to topple the trade monopoly of the CCC, others seeking to disband the Union outright, and new internal turmoil between member states, corporations, trade houses, as well as guilds now threaten the stability of the Union.